So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the Death card. And I think that this card, more so than a lot of other cards that I've covered, is one where you need to have a little bit more background, because if you think of it just in a literal sense as something dying, something passing away, I think that that can be a shock to the system if you pull this card in a reading. And I think that that interpretation of literal death is probably really rare and really extreme. So having some other options there, or just different pathways to take with this card, I think is really important. And we'll discuss some of those today. So if we look at the RWS card, we see this skeleton on a horse. And he kind of reminds me of a lot of the knights. And I think that's because he really does offer an opportunity, an opportunity for something different, a different experience, changing an action, getting rid of old feelings or systems, changing perspective. We talked about that with the Hangman card. And it really is a part of that process. It's a part of having that desire or willingness, or just knowing that something needs to change and actually transitioning into that new experience. And so it's a part of that. It's an active part of it. And it comes with a promise. So unlike a lot of other cards that are symbolic of change in the tarot, this card, more than the others, does come with this promise of hope. And that's why he has that banner with the rose on it. And that rose is a symbol of sincerity, of the willingness to really just help and bring something new and to offer this opportunity and to kind of relieve that fear, because we really shouldn't fear this type of change. This is like a type of change that is going to benefit you and I think is necessary. So the sun is also in the background to further place emphasis on that opportunity of hope that lies after whatever this transformation is that's going to take place. And so that's really what this card is. It's a transformation, a transition. It could be a transition into something totally new, or it could be a cycle. This is a card that is number 13. And so that does come after the number 12, which is connected to a lot of different cycles. So 12 months in a year, the zodiac. And this is after that number. So this is getting past all of that and starting new. It's a new beginning. And like I said, a new beginning with a promise. So let's look at some other cards here. Let's look at the Science Tarot. Science Tarot has phase change. And I think that's appropriate because you're going from one particular characteristics of a substance to another, even though that substance is still the same material. It just has a different structure, a different sort of composition in terms of just the way the components are arranged. So the particles are maybe more together or vibrating more, but they are still that same material. And I think sometimes that happens in our lives where we just take what we have and we are flexible enough to use it in a different way, sort of recycling that material into something that has a different purpose. And that takes creativity, but it does bring about a function that might be more appropriate for whatever task you're trying to do. If you're trying to cool a substance and you want to use ice, that's more efficient than just cooling it with, I don't know, water or steam, because they're just not going to have that same impact on what you're trying to do. So different types of functions for the same material. And I think that's an interesting type of transformation. But there's also that transformation that brings about a new beginning. And I think with the Tarot of the She, we can kind of see that with the infinity symbol having a skeleton and then an infant. And that's about maybe death and rebirth. And this can involve really removing a lot of what was there and keeping the things that maybe bring that have that foundation, that have that structure. And that relates to the skeleton that is on this card. It's more of a structural thing. There are some things that can always be moved from one transition into the other, but there are things that are taken away. And so you have this sort of death and rebirth, but that rebirth is not without a certain amount of foundation. So I think that both of those cards are really interesting because they kind of take different perspectives, but that happens in life. You have these different types of changes. So if we want to understand these different types of changes, we can look at the astrology that's connected to this card, which is the sign of Scorpio. So there are these three symbols or three characters that represent Scorpio, and they are the scorpion, the snake, and the eagle. And a lot of people just think of the scorpion, sorry. And I think that that's good, but I think that is more of a limited perspective of what this sign really represents. And I like on the Tabula Mundi how it has all of those characters fused into one, because they really do work in unison. They work together, I think, in most cases. So you have the eagle, which is connected to a snake body, and then you have a scorpion tail on this card. And I think that's really interesting that the artist did that, and I like that. So if we look at each one of these things individually, I think we get different functions, but as a whole, I think it leads to something beautiful. It leads to that promise that we talked about. So let's look at the scorpion. The scorpion is more of a destructive and it can be a sudden change. It's kind of similar to the Tower card. And it's something that, like I said, shouldn't be feared because it does bring about that transformation. I love on the Petra K Tarot how it shows the scorpion down here at the bottom. And then as you go up the card, it starts to transform into this beautiful flower. And it has the sun in the background. A very abstract, but I think refreshing type of image. A lot of times you just see skulls and things on the death card. And this one, I think, has just a certain beauty to it. So I really love that. And then we also have kind of a difference here. So that was more of a transformation, but we also have a transformation that has options as far as recycling and maybe moving on to something new. So on the Star Tarot, this is a really fascinating card because you have death holding this orb. And I think that orb could represent someone's true essence, their eternal self, their spark. And it seems to be offering it back to the universe. You can see that the universe has its arms out. It's been kind of personified into this being called Newt. And I think that that void in the background represents another option. And you can go back into these karmic cycles if you identify with the character, or you can be transformed and go into this sort of void. I think that those options are up to you. And I think that the more you understand that those options are available, the better. And so I always try to, in my recent videos, make sure I kind of mention that. And I think that this card from Tarot Navigators of the Mystic Sea really does embrace that idea, because you have this person being dissolved here at the bottom. They're in this sort of sea of, some sort of solution, and they're being dissolved. And that is a part of the alchemical process. So that first step is to really decay and to corrode away a lot of the ego and things that kind of link us to the physical world. And so then as we become lighter, you can see the person rising up there on the card, we're able to see things from a different perspective. And that could lead to really identifying with that eternal self and that eternal spark, as that person actually is holding now a little star there. And I think that really is the message, right? Every man and every woman is a star. And so to realize that and to finally see that is an interesting transformation. And the title of this card is Transformation. We see something similar here on the Surrealist Tarot, but this is a fascinating card because this card, I think, it kind of adds a little bit more, I think, of a restrictive nature to it. Because if you look at the person down here at the bottom, they seem to be boxed into this sort of world here with these cycles. And you have an old person here, and then you have sort of this is, I think is a xenomorph from Aliens on the other side. I'm not sure why that's represented here. That's because this image is supposed to be similar to what H.G. Geiger was an artist that kind of had this sort of imagery that in his art. And I think that the overall message here, though, is really, it really struck me the more I looked at this card, because you have two very distinct types of portrayals of reality here. There's a boundary and then a whole different world there. The experience or the transformation is nothing like what the person is experiencing while they are asleep. So while they're asleep, they're just not aware. They're not remembering. When they're not remembering and they're experiencing things from a projection sort of character state, there's a very big difference in what that experience is like versus what they really are. So that's profound. And I think that kind of ties into this card from Nicoletta Ciccoli, where the person is Sleeping Beauty. And so they are asleep, they're in this dream. So what are they dreaming about? What is that world like? Very different from when they awaken here. But those cards, the ones that I just showed you, they have that message of that second character of Scorpio, which is shedding, rebirth. The serpent, right? The serpent is about shedding the old skin, but it's also about cycles, because in the Ouroboros, we see the snake chasing its tail. So it has that twofold nature, just like we see on the star card, on the death card from the Star Tarot. So I find that really interesting because you can see that astrological foundation playing out in a lot of different cards from different decks. But I think when it comes to the eagle, I think that's the ultimate goal and ultimately reaching the promise of what this card is offering. I like on the sci-fi tarot how you have these people going into a spaceship and they are, you have Saturn in the background, and Saturn is in the shape of a skull, which is, I think, kind of clever, but they're going to be leaving the planet. They're not just leaving the planet, but they are being elevated out of, our atmosphere. So they're transitioning away from a certain type of experience, and they're going into something that's very different. And so the eagle kind of represents freedom, right? It represents going from something that was a boundary or a limitation to being freed up. So it's like leveling up, right? And so once you level up to that status of being able to go from one type of existence to another, that is that transformation that we're talking about, instead of just cycling back into the same thing. And so sometimes there are these breakthroughs, right? There's these breakthroughs to other types of experiences. It's an alchemical thing that I think is inherent in the tarot system. So if you look at the art card from the Thoth deck, on that card, you can see that there is this vessel, and on that vessel, there's a skull and there's a eagle or some type of bird. I think it's an eagle. But I think that represents that death is within this mixture, mixing it up, because on the death card, he's in a solution, right? There's these bubbles that are coming up, and he's mixing this and creating new opportunities. So he's within this whole process. He's an active part of the process. And so that's why we have this sort of skeleton that's dancing, right? A lot of people wonder, well, why is this skeleton kind of dancing or doing this weird thing on this card? And if we look at the Wheel of Change Tarot, it looks like he's sort of doing that as well. I think the Wheel of Change Tarot is a great combination of the Thoth and of the RWS sort of mixed together. And it does give you that idea of hope as well, but it does give you that alchemical perspective also. And so if we look at the Tello 777 deck, and if we look at the Thoth deck, and a couple other decks have this as well, but you can see that there's this interesting crown that Death is wearing. And that's because Death in this case is being represented by Osiris. And Osiris was an Egyptian god that rose from the underworld. So he was reborn. So this card is very symbolic of rebirth as well. And you can see the fish there also. So that fish is important because that also is a symbol of rebirth. And a lot of people don't know where that fish comes from. They sort of relate it to Christ, but it is an older symbol. It's a part of an older symbol, which is the Vesica Pisces. So if you take the Vesica Pisces and kind of simplify it, you do get that component of it. And that is the creative portion of that Vesica Pisces. And so that's where that sort of originates. But I think that that idea of rebirth comes after, of course, mowing down a lot of the things that get in the way of that. And so that's why he has that scythe. This card is connected to Saturn. And so Saturn is also the deity of Kronos, which is Father Time. And this is a deity that is very much associated with structure, with foundation. And so to have a skeleton representing him or representing this planet is, I think, ideal, because that is a foundational or structural part of the human body. And these are the things that remain. These are the things that are the active parts of making sure that these transitions take place, and they're necessary, and it serves a role. So these things do have to have that sort of foundation, or then you have chaos and things just don't work out. You have to have an organizing force. And so that is the role of Saturn in this case. Now, one other thing that I think is interesting, and I think a few decks do kind of illustrate this, and if you look at the Lubbock's Tarot here, and if you look at the Tarot of Earth Magic, we kind of see that they've included this. So if you look closely, you can see that there's an hourglass on both of these. And so one of the other tools, other than the scythe, is time. Time is a tool. As much as we try to escape it, death is inevitable. And if we look at the RWS card, nothing escapes it, no matter what the prestige or hierarchy of the individual. You can see kings there, and as well as the youth and everyone. There is a point in time where we all encounter it. You could try and try and try. You can prolong it, but it will come. And that is its tool that can't be taken away. And so that being a component of death and being connected to Saturn, I think, yeah, that makes total sense, because Saturn is Chronos, which is where we get the word chronological, which is about time. And so let's look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, because on this, we have on pathway 24, I'll put a better image of it up. So that pathway right there connects Tiphereth, which is Sephiroth 6 and Sephiroth 7, 7 being Netzach. And Netzach is more like Venus energy, emotion, and Tiphereth being the sun. And I think that's important because the emotional connection that we have to some of the things that our ego kind of puts in front of us is something that must be broken in order to kind of break cycles. And so you go from that to the sun, which is that spark, right? So it's sort of like the card that I showed you where the person was finally moving up towards that spark, towards the sun, that star. It's representing that same thing. So that same concept of going from detaching a bit from ego, from being so grounded to the physical world, and kind of seeing what you really are. And that leads to that middle pathway up the tree of life. But it's a matter of shedding or decaying a lot of the things that get in the way. And so that's why I think we should also consider here, like with the Egyptian tarot, right? This sort of idea of justice or judgment. And we have Anubis here who is weighing the heart and the mind. And you see people sinking down into this sand at his feet, right? Kind of sinking back down into the abyss. And I think it's about decaying or removing that connection with the character, with the ego that provides that, because ultimately that is the component of our existence that is connected to the cycles. Our spark is not. So in this next section, I want to take a look at some of the projective geometry. And if we take the skeleton from the death card and we put it on the wheel card, I find it really interesting how it interacts with that. Lady Frida Harris, when she designed these cards, she really did intend for them to have a connection that was connected to some sort of geometric pattern, because she studied this type of art for a while, and she infused it into the Toph deck. And so when you look at this card and you combine different things to it, it's really cool to see how these things work together. I think it'll be an interesting deck idea to kind of do this, to play around with the projective geometry and create sort of these interactions. So I don't know, that might be something that I might think about in the future, but it's really interesting how you can see the skeleton sort of spinning that wheel, because it is a part of that whole active force and change. I did this before with the Magician card, and it really did interact and give an interesting message there as well. And so it's something to really ponder and think about when you combine these things. Also with the Hangman card, if you combine it there, it's interesting how they're both sort of suspended. And when you look at the suspension system that's holding up the skeleton, it kind of connects to the foot of the Hangman. And then those other sort of support scaffolding, I guess, ropes or cables that are connected to his knee are also connected to the Hangman in an interesting way. And I think it reminds me of the card from the Telos 777, and how you can see that Osiris's head is above the water. And his head is also kind of above the water on the Hangman card and right in front of the sun, kind of coming out of those waters, coming out of that ocean and being transformed and really taking hold of that promise. So for this next part of the video, I'm going to do what I've been doing for all of my other videos about tarot, is to take an element from the periodic table and to kind of infuse that energy of that element into the meaning of the card that I'm working on. It's sort of an alchemical kind of process that I've been doing, and it helps me learn and kind of grow and kind of remember some things about my true essence. And so I want to share that with you here today. So if you're interested in that, stick around, and I'm going to go ahead and discuss that. And so the element that I'm going to be talking about is aluminum. And I think aluminum is kind of perfect for this because it's lightweight and flexible, so it can adapt to change. And I think that, like I showed you with the phase change card from the Science Tarot, it's necessary to be flexible because not every sort of situation is going to require the same solution. And so being able to have that ability, I think, is something that is inherent in aluminum. It can be used for so many different things, and it can be molded in a lot of different ways. And so that's mainly how I see it. I see it as being recycled and transformed over and over again. And part of aluminum, though, has this oxidation layer to it. So it has this layer of oxidation that resists change. And I think that's really interesting because it reminds me of the ego. It reminds me of how our ego is sometimes there, and it's a way that we fight change. It holds to our current situation. It holds to the things that we're familiar with and used to, even though they may not be the best. And we sort of fight that to kind of persevere and to maintain a certain status when it may not really be serving us at all. And you have to get rid of that layer in order for that corrosion and decay to take place, which is the first step of the alchemical process. And so when you think about the death of the ego or the transformation or seeing through the ego, that's also beginning with the Hangman card and then actually going into that new beginning in the death card. So that there's sort of a bridge there between those two cards. So I think that's really important to consider. But there is a framework that remains. And so you can also think of that oxidation layer as kind of preserving some of the things that are foundational. So aluminum still needs to maintain its components, right? It's still the same material. It's still aluminum, the element, but it needs to be molded in a way. And I think that that's really interesting. But I think that it really does take on that character of Scorpio with the snake, because it's recycled so much, right? And you have that Ouroboros of the snake representing cycles. And so aluminum is used over and over again in this cyclical type of nature as we go throughout existence.